Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks for everybody for turning up to listen. This is the first time I've spoken today, so I wasn't sure if my voice was going to work, but it seems like it is so far. But if it's not loud enough, please stop. Somebody wave at me and let me know. So last night I was thinking back to this time yesterday when Maria invited us to reflect on what we leave behind and what we take forward in today's VUCA environment. And I asked myself, when it comes to AI, how many of us are still deciding whether we'll use AI in our work, or has that moment already passed? Has it already become a given? I know at least one person in this room that doesn't use AI in their work. And I'm wondering if, is that literally a one-off, or are there quite a few of us? So yesterday's debate put forward that proposition, that AI is a replacement for humans in designing and evaluating behaviour change. It didn't win, but it wasn't unanimous. So some of us are unsure. So I think that uncertainty is actually healthy. We don't want to say that we can be replaced by AI, but don't we at least need to consider the question of whether we will, and maybe be a bit unsure? It means that we're thinking about the question, and we're not just letting the tools lead us, and we're stopping and actually asking where this is going. So some of us already shared how we've used AI in our work, and some of us even referred yesterday, more than once I heard people refer to AI as a member of their team. And we'll hear a lot more about how we can use AI to streamline research processes and tasks, and how to design AI systems to effectively and ethically nudge end users from Kate and Ryan in the workshop this afternoon. So I'm personally really looking forward to that. I'm not standing up here as an expert on how to do any of that, and that's not what I'm going to focus on this morning, but just to set the scene, I'd like to just go through a few examples of how AI is being used in Australia, and things that we can potentially relate to as, how are these things impacting us? So these examples are all from a very recent, 2025 report on an inquiry into the use and governance of artificial intelligence systems by public sector entities in Australia. You've possibly already read them all while I've been talking, the preamble, so I won't go through all of them. But one that surprised me a little bit, possibly shouldn't, was that Australian Sports Commission, so this competition analysis system in partnership with Swimming Australia prior to the 2020 Tokyo Olympic Games. So I thought that was quite interesting. And things like, there's some there that really I think could be pretty controversial. So that Department of Home Affairs, predicting risk in the visa programs, disrupting the flow of illicit goods, identifying fraudulent documents, and disrupting fraudulent travel to Australia. So, they're really things that we need to get right, aren't we? And, we've seen very much in the media in the last couple of weeks what happens when governments, not our government, doesn't get that right. So, disruption and direction. Those examples are just a few of, a few examples of how government is using AI. But, we've already, now is a time when, it's not unheard of to go into a client brief and, they sort of say, well, we've already used ChatGPT to summarise stakeholder views. And that's where we may have started in the past. And so now we need to, I guess, learn our place and, often reconsider where we're going to start and where we're going to pick up. And it's not a surprise to hear that sort of thing. It's the new normal. So I'm asking us this morning to think about how we, as researchers, as social marketers and strategists, respond. So thinking about that tension between disruption and direction. Importantly, how do we preserve, How do we preserve trust, rigour and human understanding as we integrate these technologies? So AI offers speed, scale, personalisation that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. It opens up possibilities to do more with less, to reach more people, to work faster than ever, which is very compelling. It's very compelling for me as a busy person. But those opportunities also present ethical challenges. So what happens when the data that we rely on is biased? when nuance is flattened, when we can't explain how recommendations were developed, and when decisions are made by systems that we don't even fully understand. Do we understand, whether people really gave their informed consent to be included? Things that we always, took for granted as researchers. So our work, is and needs to continue to be grounded in trust, in listening, in understanding people, not just their behaviour, but their values, their context, their challenges. I love Chris's example this morning of, being told to hold the handrails. How are we going to get that from AI? When I don't believe we are. I could be proven wrong sometime in the future. So how we respond and how we use AI today will shape the credibility of our work, going forward. So, have I moved on? No. There we go. So the promise of generative AI, it's real, but it's not neutral. Oh, sorry, I'm losing my place here. Sometimes, so what makes generative AI so appealing? The benefits are real. It's cheaper than traditional research or content development, and it can scale in ways that we could never match with human teams. I remember, Joan, you'll remember, I think it was a white paper on homelessness, and sitting in a room, in the Coleman Button boardroom, with maybe 20 or 30 casuals that we'd hired for this job, going through and reading reams and reams of papers and submissions to this white paper, and really, really worrying that, and being, trying very hard to make sure we read every word and we got to everything and we represented everyone, and doing that with a team that we had to pull together very quickly. And it was difficult. And can you imagine how, you do that like this today? And yes, we would still read the submissions, and yes, we would still talk about them, but we could spend so much more time digesting and making sense of those because of, we could do some of that, groundwork very, very simply. Sorry, I'm just going to skip there. Yep. So the promise of generative AI is real, but it's not neutral. So with every gain in speed, there's a potential loss of trust. The faster we move, the more we risk, or we face the risks of skipping that slow and boring work, of the listening, the understanding, the checking for bias. Scale sounds great, but when you scale messages or insights without context or care, that's when we can cause harm, particularly to vulnerable communities. The output is fabulous, but volume doesn't equal understanding. I don't know, if I know I'm not the only person who did a draft of their speech using AI, a first draft, and then as I went through it, had to throw out and throw out and throw out, and then read and all the references that it gave me, because there was just a lot there that I didn't need. So it's not about rejecting AI, it's about asking better questions. It's about what gets lost when we move too fast, too far, and too easily. And this is where ethics becomes really important, not as a barrier, but as a guide to how we use AI. So I'm going to quickly review 3 ethical dilemmas that are posed as a result of AI. So the first, maybe the most well-known, is that bias, that idea of generative AI bias. So who gets seen, who gets heard, and how fairly they're represented. We know AI models, large language models, are trained on massive volumes of data. Most of it's scraped from online spaces that already reflect deep inequalities. So that data overrepresents some voices and perspectives and underrepresents others. The result, the same patterns get built into the outputs. So when we're designing research projects, we're very careful about who we speak to and including those voices and even amplifying those voices that we know are underrepresented and don't get heard. But AI is not automatically doing that for us. In social marketing and behaviour change work, this can have real-world consequences. So looking back to the examples of how our government is using AI, it can shape how programs are designed, how messages are framed, whether people feel seen or othered, whether they're allowed into our country or, have to leave. So the ethical question is, whose voices are embedded in the data and whose are missing? Because if we don't ask that, we do risk amplifying the inequalities that we're trying to dismantle. The second dilemma, it may be less obvious to some of us, but it's about nuance. And, as I said, that example that Chris brought up was fabulous. So generative AI is great at finding patterns. It doesn't understand people. It doesn't recognise irony. It doesn't interpret hesitation, tears, tensions in a focus group, and I think even that loss between face-to-face research and online research, I'm not sure about anyone else, but I'm finding I really have to concentrate for those presenters that are online, and it really, takes 20-30% more effort to understand and digest what is being said. So we're moving further and further away from the source of the information that we're using. So AI can produce these fabulous clean summaries, but they can be pretty flat. And we can very easily misinterpret what people are telling us. So it remains our job to interpret, ask the follow-up questions, not necessarily of AI, but out in the real world, to understand what's being said. So the third ethical dilemma that I'll talk about is transparency, and therefore ultimately trust. So as researchers, again, we're trained to be clear about our methods, about our assumptions, about our evidence. We cite sources, we explain sampling, we outline limitations. Who cannot remember, for any of us that, started off university with, Psych 101, I'm sure we can all still remember exactly how to cite our sources because it was jammed into us so much, and you could fail. It doesn't matter how good your paper is, you fail for not getting that right. So that's a really core value to us. But with AI, that clarity disappears. So many generative AI tools are black boxes. You input a prompt, you get an output, and it looks good and it looks reasonable. And even when you are directly putting in the information, so I had an example very recently where I was asking AI to summarise some interviews that I had done, and I had just put the transcript in this same discussion of, the hallucinating AI is making up quotes for me. I'm like, I did not hear that. So I'll, sit there and argue with AI and eventually convince that, yes, I made that up. So, it can make it very hard to stand behind the insights if we're not 100% sure about the process. Informed consent. So if people don't know that their data is being used or how it's being transformed by AI, can they really give meaningful consent? I would say not. Even reporting. So, who's not using ChatGPT to summarise their open-ended questions? But how are we documenting the process of how it does that? Can we explain why this was coded one way and not another? Can it be contested? Can it be reviewed? Is it being reviewed? So if we look to SMR's AI guidance, they're really clear. If you can't explain how a system works, you shouldn't rely on it to produce insight. So that's not about being anti-AI, it's about making sure that the tools we use don't erode that credibility that we've built up over so many years. Because if people can't trust that process, they're not going to trust the outcome. They're not going to trust us. So what should guide us? What does ethical use of AI in social research and marketing actually look like? So we're not starting from scratch. We've already got ethical frameworks for AI, and while each has a slightly different emphasis, they all point to the same core ideas. So the frameworks that I looked at have been developed by CSIRO, UNESCO, OECD and SMR. Each of them has a slightly different emphasis, but essentially they all point to the same 5 core ideas: human-centred values, fairness and inclusion, transparency and explainability, accountability, and privacy and data protection. I did come across another one, which I didn't put on the slide, but I thought was quite interesting, that the Australian Sports Commission is also partnering with CSIRO to develop the Responsible AI in Sport position paper. And the reason I mention that is because that is pretty specific. And I guess, I'll come back to that later. How specific do we need to be in terms of the frameworks or guidelines that we use? Can we rely on these guidelines, or do we need to develop our own? So the first one, human-centred values. The message is consistent among these frameworks. AI must serve people, not replace them, or manipulate them, or reduce them to data points. In social marketing, that means designing AI systems that respect autonomy, dignity, diversity, especially for those groups excluded from decision-making. So, of course, we can't claim to be human-centred if we hand over the interpretive parts of our work to systems that don't understand people. And I don't think any of us think we're doing that or want to do that or would seek to do that. But it's really actively ensuring that we don't do that. The next one, fairness and inclusion. So the OECD talks about inclusive growth. CSIRO talks about fairness. UNESCO talks about non-discrimination. So I've grouped those sorts of things together, the common thread being that AI should reduce inequality and not entrench it. So when we do use AI to design messages, code responses, segment audiences, we need to ask ourselves, as we always do, who benefits and who might be harmed? And are those risks visible, or are they buried in the training data and the algorithms, and are we even aware of them? The next one, transparency and explainability. So this one shows up in all of these frameworks. AI systems must be explainable not just to the experts, but to participants, to policymakers, to the public, to ourselves, of course. For us, that means we need to document how AI is used in research and research design and reporting. What tools were used, what data did they rely on, what steps were automated, and what required human judgment. We owe it to our clients and our communities to keep this process open and auditable. From back in the days 20 years ago where we would not, send a report to a client without a very detailed, replicable methodology, to so many of our government clients even want the headlines, the PowerPoint report, and we still provide the methodology, but it might, it's an appendix at best, and it's probably not looked at. So there are benefits to sharing information in a way that it can be digested, but the background and that rigour still counts. Accountability is the next one. So CSIRO frames this one as contestability. So I've joined these together. So if an AI-generated insight, for example, is flawed, who's responsible? If a chatbot unintentionally distorts the message, who fixes it? So we need ethical frameworks here to remind us that AI doesn't absolve us of this responsibility, it actually increases it. As researchers, we need to stay in the loop. Not just technically, but ethically. So the algorithm might write it, but if we deliver it and put our name on it, we're responsible for it. We own it. So where does this leave us? We've talked about the risks, we've looked at dilemmas, we've explored the principles, but I want to end, on a high note, I guess, on a positive, with the potential. So, I do genuinely believe that humans plus AI are absolutely more powerful than either of us alone, even from a productivity sense. These tools can help us move faster, go deeper, expand access. They can help us communicate more clearly, model behaviour and personalise interventions. But they still need us. They need our judgment, our context, our questions, our ethics. We decide if a chatbot is useful when it's not safe to use one. We decide how consent should be explained. We decide whether the insight is actually meaningful or it just sounds good. And, you know, AI constantly asks you, if I say thank you, I'm glad that made you happy. So, you know, that's what AI is trying to do. It's trying to make us happy, give us what we want. And we don't always need what we want, we need what we need. So if we can bring that mindset to our research, our communications and our behaviour change work, or if we can maintain that mindset while we're using AI for our research, our communications and our behaviour change work, you know, we're not just adapting to the future, we're helping shape it. And again, I think all of us got a huge amount out of Maria's speech yesterday. You know, and I think that while she didn't talk about AI, you know, I think all of those sentiments that she expressed about, you know, taking that opportunity and shaping, being part of the change and the disruption, not letting it happen to us. So as I hinted at earlier, you know, I want to leave with a challenge. As AI becomes more embedded in what we do, we're going to keep getting asked, can it do this, can it write that, can it replace the steps in the process, how much money can we save by doing this, and we've already done this, so surely it's only going to cost us this to do this now. But the more important questions are not what AI can do or replace, but the ethical ones. How should we use it? When shouldn't we use it? What are the risks if we move too fast without thinking deeply enough? So let's lead this, not just adapt to it. Let's build the systems that are ethical by design, not just efficient. You know, and I think that we should start by co-designing a shared ethical framework for how AI is used in social marketing, something built by us, not just handed down by tech platforms or procurement teams, because it's our moment to lead, not just in what we do, but how we do it. You know, I think that is probably my question for the room. You know, do we need to be developing our own framework or guidelines for use of AI as an association, or do we continue to draw from those that we have? Thank you.
Okay, this is on. Thank you so much. We have time for some questions. We'll start with any online. Student volunteers, are there any online? No? Okay. So we can go to the room. Any? Yes, okay, Mike. Give the mic to Mike.
Probably got a loud enough voice anyway. But, I was interested, you know, obviously firms are using AI more and more. To what extent are you truthful to your clients that you are using AI to write, to research, to analyse, to do those kinds of things? And is there a need for a new role? And I wrote it down, the AI truth analyst that sits inside an organisation that stress tests your use of AI in terms of its truthfulness, in terms of whether or not it's right references, right kinds of things. So how do we improve our internal capacity to use it in an appropriate way, I guess is a short question.
I don't have the answer to that question, but I absolutely agree. So Christine sent me an AI ethics, you know, our process for AI, and I'm like, I'll look at that later, Christine. So, and I felt I could do that because I'm not using AI to a huge extent in my work because of all these concerns. I do use AI to do bits and pieces to make me more efficient and so on. But in the example that I gave recently of using AI, so yeah, the lead researcher on that project asked us to use AI, but I am pretty sure that those people that we had spoken to were not informed about that. Now, in this case, I did the interviews, so I know that even though I got AI to help write the summaries, I knew, you know, like this quote when it was wrong and so on. But if I didn't, and even so, yeah, I feel that those people should have been advised, absolutely. And we do need the Christines of the world who, you know, to keep us in line.
Great, we'll do one last question.
I think just to add to that as well, I mean, I'd just say I use AI massively and in all parts of life. And I think for me, the thing that I'd say to your point, is that you have to take responsibility for it. You know, you have to check it. You have to, you know, just as you would if, you know, looking at the work of a junior researcher, you have to take responsibility for it, and it's no different. If you want to brainstorm, you don't have to take the brainstorm as a mandate to do every idea, but it's really useful. If you want to test some thinking, you can. You don't have to follow every guideline. It's really useful.
Yep.
If you want to plan a workshop, you know, there are so many things, but you have to take responsibility, and it's kind of on you, I think, in the end.
Absolutely.
So, sorry, statement rather than a question.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you.
Okay, I really liked your comment about we need a checklist or a set of guidelines for using Gen AI in social marketing research, and I'm thinking that would make an excellent journal article for the Journal of Social Marketing. So, Anne-Marie, where are you? Yep. So I think that would be a fantastic one to be perhaps led by a practitioner, so maybe go and have a chat to our editor of Journal of Social Marketing, because I know I would like to read something like that. I think that would be really useful. Thank you very much, Carolyn.